good evening, everyone. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about something that I'm really passionate about, which is epidemiology. And I'm excited to share with you how epidemiology kind of informs your day-to-day life. You may not even know it, and how we use this study to help make the world healthier. So a little bit about me before we get started. I have a Bachelor in Health Sciences from Interdisciplinary Health Department here at the U of M and a Master's in Community Health Sciences. After I finished my Master's, I did a couple of years as a research associate in mental health research before starting my PhD in community health. And I work with Dr. Megan Azad, who is a Tier 2 research chair in developmental origins of chronic disease. And we study breastfeeding and a variety of different outcomes, but the one that I'm most focused on for my thesis project is how breastfeeding is related to child neurodevelopment. So that's a little bit about me. Before we get into the lecture today, I want to pop up a quick poll just to get everyone's opinion on this question. So, hold on. Gonna launch it. Oh, thanks. Did I? Wait, can you see the poll? Yeah? Okay. All right, folks, who has heard of epidemiology before? Please answer the poll. Nope, can't see the question. Okay, let's try it again. How about now? Oh, people are responding. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you for the feedback. Okay. Yes, no, or unsure. Great. Everyone's answered. Everyone's heard of it. Amazing. So hopefully today what we're going to do is give you some examples, some practical examples, and then go a little bit more into some specific terms and some study designs in epidemiology. All right, so here's the definition. The study, epidemiology, is the study of the distributions and determinants of disease frequency in human populations, that's important, and the application of this study to control health problems. So let's give some examples to make this more clear. So some popular examples that you will for sure be familiar with include the study of the effectiveness of vaccines. So you'll probably be most familiar with this with the recent COVID vaccines, but this applies to all different types of vaccines. And we develop vaccines because we don't want people to get sick from diseases, and we test them. And then in Canada, at least, these vaccines are available to everyone, and we encourage people to get them. So the application is from the studies that look at the effectiveness of vaccines. We then encourage people to have them, and we give them out for free. Another example is how seatbelts prevent injury. So if you're wearing a seatbelt when you get in a car accident, you're less likely to get seriously injured. And studies that showed this link were then used to make several applications. One of them is fines. If you're caught not wearing a seatbelt, you can get charged money, but also that really annoying dinging sound that happens in your car if you're not wearing your seatbelt, which I would argue is probably a more immediate and effective way of making people wear their seatbelts because it affects you every time right then and there when you're in your car. So another example of an application. Smoking causes lung cancer. So there have been studies that have proven this now over the last several decades, that people who smoke are more likely to have lung cancer. And of course, we want to minimize the amount of people who are suffering from lung cancer. So the application is to put a lot of limits on the tobacco industries. So this involves that smoking is banned in many places. You can't smoke in many places, especially inside. And also the sale of cigarettes is heavily regulated. It's difficult even nowadays to go into a place and actually be able to see cigarettes. They're often behind a closed cabinet. And so these applications are meant to limit the behavior of smoking. And finally, physical activity improves heart health. So this can be really any kind of physical activity that will, in walking, strength training, running, helps your heart to be healthy. So studies that have proven this link have led to the application of some companies providing free gym passes or pots of money that can be used to sign up for a sports team or buy some type of sports equipment. The expansion of bike lanes and parks in cities, and also the development of national physical activity guidelines. So having a document that's available that you can find on the internet that's for age and gender specific, and you can see, am I meeting the guidelines for optimal health or not? And then maybe you can change your behavior. So if we go back to our definition, we can see the study of the distribution and determinants of disease frequency in a human population from these examples. So the disease frequency of viruses and how they're prevented with vaccines, the frequency of injury, lung cancer, and heart health, and these different applications to control health problems. So different ways that we apply this data is to have vaccines for people, have seatbelt mandates, smoking limitations, and to encourage physical activity. So now I want to tell you a story of a person named John Snow. He is credited to be the father of epidemiology. And the reason he is credited to be the father of epidemiology is due to a study that he did way back in the 1800s on cholera. So this is a picture of John Snow, and he was a physician in London. He specialized in anesthesiology. But in 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in Soho, London, where he was living. And it caused widespread disease and death. It was very serious. Cholera is a bacteria that we now know is spread through contaminated water, but at that time, it was believed that it could be spread through pollution or bad air, so perhaps airborne. However, John Snow was skeptical of this because he didn't understand how it worked, and there really was no evidence at the time for any of this. So he decided to go around and use a different method and map out all of the cases of cholera in the area in Soho, London. So he went around door to door and he asked people if they were sick or not. And he also asked them which pump they received water from. People took water from pumps at that time. You can see on this map that there's a few different pumps in the area. And so all of the dots are the people who had cholera. And you can see that they're kind of clustered around pump A. And so by making this map, he was able to see that perhaps pump A was the source of cholera and contaminated water. Now, at that time, they didn't even have microscopes that could actually see the bacteria in a sample of water. So really, he was just going off of this map to make that conclusion. But the evidence was strong enough to convince the local council to at least try removing the handle from that water pump A. And a few weeks later, the cholera outbreak sharply declined. So clearly there was, that was the source of the disease. So that's just an example. It's a fairly famous example of how looking at the distribution and determinants of disease, cholera in this case, can lead to an application taking off this water pump handle that controls the disease outbreak. Okay, so let's move into some important concepts in epidemiology. I'm going to go through a few key terms and then give you some examples. So first of all, I want to introduce you to the word exposure. I'm sure all of you have heard this word before, but in epidemiology specifically, exposure means an event or factor of interest that the population is exposed to and is hypothesized to be associated with an outcome. So in our water cholera example, drinking the water was the exposure. And the word outcome. Outcome is an event or factor of interest that's hypothesized to be the result of an exposure. So in this case, the outcome was if you got cholera or if you didn't. And you'll notice that there is typically a temporal relationship between the exposure and the outcome. So one kind of key way to think about it is which one came first and which one is the result of something else. Next, I want to introduce you to the word incidence. Incidence is defined as the frequency of a new event over time in a population. So here's an example. For example, 25 out of 2,000 or 0.0125% of the population that was living in that area, Soho, had a new onset cholera case between June 2nd and June 4th. The key with incidence is to focus on this word, new onset. So this term is only interested in those who had cholera, got it, were infected with it in that particular time period. It does not matter if someone had it before and currently had it in that time period as well. It only matters if it's a new case within that time period. You can also do adjusted incidence for really any type of subgroup that you want to. So this is basically just the frequency of a new event over time in a specific population subgroup. I'll give you an example adjusted by age. So another example here, 40 out of 700 or 5.7% of the population age 0 to 12, so children living in Soho had a new onset cholera diagnosis between June 2nd and June 4th. So you can see that the denominator is smaller because the population is only looking at a certain age group of people. Next, we have the term prevalence. And this is defined as the frequency of the existence of a current event over time in the entire population. Now, the difference between prevalence and incidence is that prevalence is not concerned with if the case is a new onset case or not. So if you add up all of the people that currently had cholera between June 2nd and June 4th, they would all be added into the prevalence. So for example, 200 out of 2,000 or 10% of the population living in Soho had cholera between that time period. You can see that the prevalence is typically much higher than the incidence because depending on the time period that you're looking in, typically people will have had the disease for an earlier time and currently then still have it. And finally, you can also adjust this term, this frequency. So you can adjust based on age or based on any other kind of characteristic. So adjusted prevalence is the frequency of the existence of a current event over time in a specific population. So again, there was 100 out of 700 or 14% of the children in that area were infected with cholera in that time period. So I'm going to give you a couple more examples that are maybe a bit more modern than cholera. So let's look at some examples of adjusted prevalence. So here is some hypothetical data on the frequency of breast cancer stratified by 2 different countries. So we're adjusting for country here. So if you were just to look at the number of cases, you might conclude that country A has a higher prevalence of breast cancer than country B, 100 compared to 75. But we don't have all the information that we need in order to understand the adjusted prevalence. What we didn't know from just looking at the number of cases is that the population size is way bigger in country A compared to country B, and that the follow-up period is different in these 2 countries. So country A, follow-up period is 1 year, and country B, it's 3 years. So when we adjust for both population size and the follow-up period in both of these countries, we can see that actually country B has a higher prevalence per 100,000 people per year compared to country A. And that's why it's important for us to kind of have this full picture of information before drawing conclusions about what these number of cases mean. Another example is adjusted incidence. So again, the only difference here is that now we're looking at the number of new cases in a time period compared to just the number of cases overall in the whole population. And this is hypothetical data on the frequency of hospital admissions for COVID-19 between May and June. Hypothetical, made up. So if you were just to look at the number of cases, you might think, oh, the people who have their vaccines are much more likely to go to the hospital with COVID than the people who don't. But if we look at then the denominator, if we look at the population size, we can see that the denominators are very different between these 2 groups. There's actually way more people in the population group that's vaccinated. And when we look at the adjusted incidence, we can see that the proportion is actually higher in the unvaccinated group. So it's important to know our denominator and to know what our subgroup is comprised of. So we're going to move on to study design now, but I want to just pause for a minute and ask if anyone has questions on the topics that we've covered so far. You're welcome to ask me in the chat. I will keep an eye on it. Or if you want to just ask it out loud, I'll give you a couple minutes to think about it. Feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout if you want, and I will try to answer them at the end. Cool. Yeah, Mackenzie didn't realize that EPI could be applied to such a broad range of topics. Yes, it's very broad. Seatbelt use. Yeah, there was a time when seatbelts were not, didn't even exist in cars. So we need to do studies to convince people that it was worth it. And maybe you don't know that when seatbelts were first introduced in cars, there was a big backlash. People did not like it. It was constricting and it didn't go with the vibe of what it was to have a car. But that slowly declined. And now, of course, it's very common to wear seatbelts. Okay, let's move on to study design. So today I want to, I'll just answer this one question before I move on. Check the denominator in order to make conclusions in EPI, but not just the number of people who've contracted the disease. Yeah, that's right. So it's important that we know what group we're talking about when we have a number floating around. So if you were to say something about an entire population, let's say the whole population of Canada, then you could say blah, blah, blah percent of Canadians. But if we wanted to stratify by, let's say, or adjust by sex, so looking at males or females or by age, all of those groups are going to have different numbers of people in them. There's typically more people in their 30s and 40s than there are in their 80s and 90s. And so the same number of people is going to have a different percentage, which is more comparable. If we can have percentages, we can compare, okay, 5% in this group, but 10% in this group. Maybe that was the part that wasn't quite clear. So we can make a percentage that's comparable across groups. Awesome. Great. Okay, so let's talk about two different types of study design today. I think you may have heard of experimental study designs before in this course. These include randomized controlled trials, or sometimes they're also called clinical trials. And there's also another branch of study designs called observational study designs. And these are very, very, very common in epidemiology. So there's different types of studies that we can do. We can do ecological studies, cross-sectional, case control, and cohort, which are longitudinal, follow people over time. And if you're interested in these studies, case control, cross-sectional, or ecological, maybe look into the social epidemiology course in the undergrad program at the U of M. And but today we're just going to talk about cohort studies and randomized controlled trials. So the whole purpose of doing a study is to examine relationships between exposures and outcomes. We want to see how certain things affect other things, which typically are health problems. And then we want to see what can we do about it? How can we apply it? So let's talk about some of the key features of randomized controlled trials. So the key feature of RCT, randomized controlled trial, is that the exposure is randomized. This is really important, and this is kind of like the hallmark of what makes an RCT an RCT, is that you can only do this with exposures that you can randomize. So these are very common in drug trials where you can give one group of people a drug and you can give the other group of people a placebo pill, or nutrition trials where you can give one group of people a smoothie with a supplement and the other group a smoothie without the supplement. And the idea here is that people sign up, they're all people from kind of whatever your inclusion group is. So sometimes it's anybody in the whole population, sometimes it's just seniors, sometimes it's just pregnant women, and you randomly put them into different groups. And what should happen then is that there shouldn't be differences in the two groups other than the exposure. So the only different thing should be, did the person get the smoothie with the supplement, or did they get the smoothie without the supplement? And then you can look at outcomes over time for a defined period of time and see, did that smoothie make a difference or not? So the exposure is randomized, very important. Another key feature is that the exposure group is often unknown to the participants and certain staff members. So this is called blinding. And this is when the person who is getting either the exposure or the placebo doesn't know what they're getting. Now, this can't always be done in all trials because sometimes it's not ethical not to tell people, but it is important so that we don't have any biases of people who think that they are getting an exposure, or they know that they're getting an exposure that has some type of effect, and then they go on to then have that effect. So this is to eliminate or reduce bias in the study outcomes. In RCTs, the follow-up time is predetermined and the outcome is watched for. So typically these trials are very heavily regulated by ethical standards, and so you need to be very clear about what exactly you're looking for and when you think that it will show up by. So sometimes trials are, a month long. They could be longer depending on what you're looking at, maybe a couple of months, or they could even be a couple of weeks depending on the outcome that you're interested in, but they're typically quite regulated. The sample can be a specific group of people or representative of the whole population. It depends on what you're interested in studying. They're commonly used to test drugs or vaccines, as I said. And they're often considered the highest form of evidence for making health decisions. And this is because they're typically seen to have not a lot of bias associated with them. So usually an RCT would be considered that if one group that got the exposure and you saw an outcome in that group only, then you can attribute it to whatever the exposure was. And that's not as true in other types of study designs, which I will show you in a moment. Let's look at an example. Okay, so probably you're all familiar with this vaccine, and maybe even some of you have learned more about RCTs through this vaccine process. But here's an example. So sample population for the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine trials were individuals over age 16 who were healthy or had stable medical conditions and had not had prior COVID-19 infection. So I think this trial was done end of 2020. So those people were recruited and then they were randomized to either be injected with the vaccine or injected with saline solution. So everybody got a needle and people didn't know if they got the vaccine or not. They then looked for 7 days adverse events. So if there was any type of reaction or any common adverse event that would happen in the vaccinated group compared to the saline group. And they also looked for efficacy of the vaccine to protect against COVID for 14 days after the second dose. So I think they're about a month apart. So the trial would have gone on for about 6 weeks or so. And that was the very specific outcome that they were interested in. And at the end of these trials, it was then determined that the vaccine was effective at preventing COVID cases. And the way that would have happened is that they would have seen less cases and less outcome of COVID in the group that got the vaccine compared to the group that did not. Let's talk about cohort studies. So remember, cohort studies are studies that are observational, which means that the exposure is not random. So I'm noticing that there are 2 questions about RCTs. I'm going to answer those right now before we continue into cohort studies. Double-blind experiment, yes. If the participant, as well as the person who would be like administering the vaccine or would be blending up the smoothie, doesn't know if they're doing a control or an experiment group, it's double-blind. Sometimes it's single-blind if only the participant doesn't know what group they're in, but typically double-blind. Do randomized controlled trials apply only for animal studies? No. You can do RCTs for animals, but also for humans, as example with the COVID vaccine. Is it considered ethical to let people get infected with the disease during a clinical trial of a prospective treatment? Yeah, that's a great question. So ethics play hugely into epidemiology, especially with RCTs where you're actually purposely giving a group of people a certain exposure. And I think for every trial, it has to go through a board of people who then decide what's ethical. But in the case where it's a new treatment, where we're not totally sure if it works or not, we need to be able to do these trials to see if the new treatment that we're hoping is going to work is actually better than just getting nothing or maybe getting a standard treatment. So I think at the point in which things are still being tried out to determine if they are actually have efficacy, they're actually efficacious, then yes, it is ethical. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about ethics in just a minute. And the major reason why we need to do cohort studies for a lot of different exposures is due to ethics. So let's move on. I will take a look at the questions again at the end of this section. So cohort studies are observational in design, which means that the exposure is not randomized. So the people that are in the study sample either had an event happen to them or they chose to do an event, but it was not administered by the study and it was not under controlled conditions. So an example of this that's common in the work that I do is when we look at breastfeeding. In my thesis research, I'm using data from a cohort study to be able to look at parents who breastfeed or formula feed their babies and then follow up over time and see what their neurological outcomes are like. It's not ethical to randomize infant feeding. There's a lot of different things that go into making that decision, some that are within and some that are without the parents, or within or not within the parents' control. And so we need to revert to a different type of study design. We cannot do a randomized control trial looking at the exposure of breastfeeding. So a cohort study is the next best thing. Another key quality of a cohort study is that the researchers will create groups based on the exposure and then look for incidence or prevalence of the outcome over time. So typically cohort studies last a long time. They can last a year, or they can last, I think there's one really famous study in the US that has been going on for over 70 years now. It's called the Framingham Heart Study, and they have 3 generations of people that have been included in their cohort over time, and they look at heart health mostly. Confounding can be a problem, and I'm going to define confounding for you on the next slide, but very briefly, confounding is differences in the exposure and the non-exposed group, which can impact the outcome as well. So hold the question on that for a minute. I'm going to explain a little bit more on the next slide. This is typically seen as the highest form of evidence when you can't randomize an exposure, which again, I said happens quite often. And the study can extend for years or decades and continue to extend based on funding. You can examine lots of different outcomes in the same population in a cohort study, so you're not limited to just looking at one specific thing, but you can look at lots of different things depending on what data you collected. Okay, let's talk about confounding and what this means. So this is a really key concept in epidemiology because it helps us be able to understand statistical relationships better. Confounding is an exposure that's related to both the main exposure of interest and your outcome, and it creates a false statistical relationship between your exposure and outcome. So let's say I collected a bunch of data from people one day who were eating ice cream and also people who were around water. And I looked at the prevalence of drowning that day. And it was a really hot day. It was like plus 30. And I saw, wow, on the day where everyone was eating ice cream, there was also a much higher incidence of drowning. Does eating ice cream mean you're more likely to drown? And the answer is no, because I didn't control for a really important confounder, which is that both of the people who are eating more ice cream and who are more likely to be drowning were at the beach. And so you can see how being at the beach is obviously related to more people drowning because they're around water, but it also is related to more people eating ice cream because they're out by the canteen and it's hot, and that's a fun thing to do. So what I mean by adjusting for this confounder is typically when we look at these types of data, we can go on to software programs and type in different codes. And if we have a measure of were you at the beach, yes or no, we can input that variable and kind of take away the effect of being at the beach. And probably what would happen after you take away that effect is that there would be no relationship between ice cream and drowning anymore. Let's do another example of maybe something that's a little bit more, well, it's more familiar to me, but more practical, probably more realistic in the types of studies that you might find yourself doing. So if we were to look at the relationship between breastfeeding and neurodevelopment, we might see a relationship. We might see that there's statistically important effect size. But if we didn't adjust for a lot of confounding factors that can influence both the decision to breastfeed or the ability to breastfeed and the neurodevelopment of the child, we might be seeing something that isn't actually due to breastfeeding, but it might be due to income or education or mental health or birth mode. And so what we do is we get measures of all of these other factors that could be playing a role, and we adjust for them in statistical models and kind of take away the effect of these factors. So this is just kind of one simple example, and this can get more complicated, but it's really important to think about confounding and adjust for it in cohort studies. So let's look at an example of a study that describes a cohort. So here, this is the Japanese lifespan study. This is a very interesting study that used a natural disaster to study the effects of radiation on outcomes, health outcomes. So this study population involved those who lived in Nagasaki in Japan when an atomic bomb was dropped in the 1900s. Now, it was not random who was living close to the bomb location, who was living away, because people would be living in certain neighborhoods based on socioeconomic status, based on the job that they have, based on the type of schedule that they had that day. So they were split into two groups, those who lived within 10 kilometers and those who lived farther than 10 kilometers from the location of the radiation. And then they followed them up over time. And they looked for cancer death, mental health, physical health, and child development. Some important confounders that were adjusted for in this study were things like education, income, family risk of cancer, so if someone was already predisposed to having cancer, and other environmental pollutants that may have been in that location where they were living that could affect their risk of cancer or mental or physical health conditions. Okay, so let's summarize what we've learned. This might be a good slide for when I put on the other end of the slide to screenshot for your activity, but I'll tell you when to do that before I move to the next one. So let's just review the pros and cons of RCTs and cohort studies. So the pros of RCTs include that the groups are random and they shouldn't differ on important variables, so we don't really need to worry about confounding. If the study is blinded, there isn't really a risk that the study personnel or the participant is going to change their behavior based on whatever group that they're in. And RCTs also capture a clear temporal sequence between the exposure and the outcome. So it's really obvious to us the exposure came first and then the outcome. A couple of cons is that it's difficult to use for health behaviors or exposures that are known to cause health problems or health benefits due to ethics. So that example where we cannot randomize how a parent chooses to feed their baby. It can be very costly and timely to do these types of studies. They can be a large burden on the participant depending on what you're asking someone to do. Sometimes people don't adhere to the treatment very well. So if you tell them, drink this smoothie every day for 5 days and we're going to see the outcome, but they only drink it for 3 days, well, you're not going to have a very good exposure group. And sometimes people drop out, and they could drop out based on certain factors, which could bias your results. And it's not always possible to implement these exposures in the real world. So you could do a RCT on a really awesome school program where kids get lunch and they get special enrichment and extra activities. And you say, oh, these kids do so much better. But if it's not feasible to actually implement it in the real world, then it wasn't necessarily worth making us believe that it would be important if we can't actually do it. Cohort studies. Pros: can study a large range of outcomes from an exposure. You can capture a clear temporal sequence of the exposure and the outcome because you're looking at data over time, over a period of years. The timeline can be expanded to capture more data for longer periods of time. So we're not limited to just a 6 or 8 week trial. You can do, oh, we want a 2-year study. Oh, we have more funding. We want to expand it for 3 more years. And you can do that with a cohort. And the cohort studies are effective for conditions that impact a large amount of the population. So things like mental health or asthma, things that have a high prevalence, are typically good to study with cohorts. Some of the cons is that you might need a really large sample size in order to find the outcome that you're interested in. Of course, lots of people just won't ever have asthma, or they won't ever have a mental health problem. And so then you need to have enough people so that you actually have some people in the group you're interested in. They can be very expensive and time consuming. And again, people can drop out and that can bias your results. We are at time, folks. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to send Toby the answers to the second case study and also my contact info if you want to contact me afterwards. I'm happy to chat or answer more questions, but I want to respect your time today. So thanks everyone so much for coming and for listening.